Hello class and welcome to this Karate Kid NES walkthrough right here on Video Games 101 by way of Let's Play with Briggins. I'm your instructor, Professor Briggins, your Mr. Miyagi, as it were, today, here in the Karate Kid. Another LJN title, very short game, as was, I think, generally the case with LJN games for whatever reason. I know they were using different developers, but we'll bring in Fluff in just a second to kind of front load us with a fact about this game, because it is so very short, as I mentioned. It's decently challenging as well. The first half of the game, pretty easy. I'd probably give that something like a 3 or a 4, honestly, but once you get into those last 2 levels, yes, there's only 4 levels, but yeah, those last 2 levels, the last 5 minutes of the game, if you will, 50%, however you want to quantify that, they're decently challenging, so much so that I'm going to give Karate Kid for the NES a 7 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. On frustration scale, this equates to punching a hole through the wall, very fitting for this class, maybe a drum punch through the wall, but we'll give you some tips which will help you keep your walls intact. So because the game is barely 10 minutes if you play right through it like we intend to, let's bring in Fluff now before we get into the game and give us some facts about Karate Kid for the NES.
Like the majority of NES games based on films or TV shows, The Karate Kid was not surprisingly published by LJN. As I mentioned in previous classes on LJN published games, they were originally a toy company who were acquired by MCA in the mid-80s, at which point they broke into video game licensing. LJN made deals with a number of production companies and studios to make games based on popular films and properties of the day, as was the case with The Karate Kid. As with every other LJN published game, the company outsourced the actual development duties to established and accomplished developers in the world of NES games, including Rare, or in the case of The Karate Kid, Atlas. Atlas, who has credits on likely over 100 titles today, including one of our favorites on the NES and Rockin' Cats, they were actually LJN's first and most frequent collaborator of the late 80s, developing LJN's licensed titles for Jaws, Gotcha the Sport, Town and Country Surf Designs, and another one of our favorites on the NES, and the underrated and oft misunderstood Friday the 13th, which was one of their final collaborations before LJN shifted to favoring and outsourcing most of their NES jobs to either Rare or Beam Software. While Atlas made some solid titles for LJN, including a couple of the games we just mentioned, this ain't one of them. Not only does it disappointingly focus on the events of the second Karate Kid film, largely taking place in Japan, while lazily tying in the climactic final scene of the original film as the first level in this game, the gameplay itself is about as sloppy as it gets. At times it feels more like a game of pinball, with Daniel-san as the ball as enemies bounce you around, stun-locking you, or knocking you into water whether you're careful or not. They also throw in a Street Fighter-like fighting mode on the side if you have a second player, but considering the gameplay there is the same as it is in the game itself, I think I'll pass if you're thinking about asking me, Professor.
No, my intentions are to get through this class as quickly as possible. Thanks, Fluff. So let's run that intro and get into this Karate Kid NES walkthrough right here on Video Games 101. Alright, before we start our game, let's take a quick look at the controls for the Karate Kid. Only thing to really point out is that if you have crane kicks or drum punches, sort of the special premium moves you have a finite number of, and you don't want to use one, just hold left or right when you hit B or A to do a regular kick or punch, respectively. And let's bring in Gary, probably earlier than we ever have on Video Games 101, to give us tips on getting through this first stage in the tournament.
It's Scary Gary's Boss Beaters.
That's right, happy to be here, Professor. Bet most of the class isn't even in their seats yet, but here we are in the tournament. You get 4 crane kicks to use through the 4 rounds of the tournament, so I like to use 1 crane kick per round in the tournament. Just bait in whoever your opponent is and use that crane kick to get them as close as possible so you can dish out as much damage from that kick as possible. And then hold right and hit the kick button to just get those kicks in when the enemy is at the maximum distance. Repeat this process for every opponent. It'll work, and you'll move on to the next stage.
Thank you, Gary, and we are on to Japan just like that. Note that if they do any damage to you during that tournament, you don't get to recover anything. Your health is still where it was at the end of that last round. Just like I suppose they didn't give Daniel a chance to recover after Bobby did that low blow kick to his leg in the tournament in the film. But anyway, let's take a look at the Briggs notes now for this Karate Kid walkthrough. Always be moving because the enemies never stop coming. Don't engage near water. Daniel can't swim. That's an instant death. Don't get surrounded or you'll get pinballed around like Fluff kind of mentioned in the opening. Stay low. We'll talk about that. And chase me. We'll talk about that as well. And now with a quick overview of the items, or the few that there are, here's Blaze.
Alright, not much in the way of pickups here in the Karate Kid. You have the crane kicks, which appear every now and then. These give you 2 health back and an extra crane kick to your total. And then you'll see Mr. Miyagi, Kamiko, and Sato spread out along some of the Japanese stages. These will substantially refill your health. When you find one of these, make sure you grab them. They're only on the screen for a very limited amount of time. Note that you can't get the drum punches. These are only gotten from the bonus stages, which I will cover as well. But the crane kicks, these are the only ones which pop up on the screen throughout this game.
Thank you, Blaze. You can jump in these doorways to do mini games to grab extra crane kicks and drum punches. Blaze, tips on this one?
Alright, the ice block. Now, the amount of power Daniel uses or has available to him in that bar which goes up and down, so you gotta hit it when it's at the max. This is dependent on how much health you have in that stage at that time. So your best chance of destroying all of the ice blocks is if you have full health and you hit it when that bar is max. But that's how you do that to get the maximum bonus of crane kicks and drum punches.
Good call, Blaze. So you can't drop down levels, but sometimes just by virtue of the terrain you can accidentally drop down without meaning to, maybe. So just be very aware of the terrain that you're walking on, how it's dipping down, and things like that. And we're trying to conserve our crane kicks. Use those if we're just surrounded. In most cases, it's sort of your break glass move in case of an emergency. But you can see how we're just bouncing off these enemies sometimes. Note that it doesn't hurt you to bounce off them, but it makes it difficult to get a move off to kill them, and then they might get hits in on you. But anyway, coming up on the second boss now. Much like the first, let's go back to Gary.
Boss beaters.
Alright, for the second boss, you should have some crane kicks saved up. Just like we did in the tournament, just stand in the middle of the screen basically this time. Let him come to you. Use 2 crane kicks to take him down.
Thank you, Gary. So this third stage is pretty much just like the last stage, only more difficult. This is where the game really cranks up its difficulty. We'll talk about that after Blaze gives us some tips on the swinging hammer.
Alright, the swinging hammer is probably the most difficult of all of the mini games. Basically, you want to just find that sweet spot like we show. Basically, when it's just about to hit you, maybe a little bit before that, hit A when it's on the right side of you. Then when it moves to the left, turn to the left. Repeat this in that same sweet spot. If you can last this for 6 revolutions, you'll get the max bonus out of it, but very difficult to nail this.
Thanks, Blaze. There's Mr. Sato kind of blending in, depending on what's going on in the background at that time. Note that you need to jump up there on those bricks, because if you just try walking to the right, you'll drop right into the drink right there. When in doubt, jump even when it looks like there's land over a gap beneath you. That's my rule. So obviously what makes this stage difficult is, we have projectiles coming at us, making those jumps harder. Just the fact that the wind is pushing us back. We don't get quite as much of the speed that we want when we're trying to make a jump over a gap and things like that. And then we have enemies too, trying to knock us around, pinball Daniel around. So there you go, you can see the swinging hammer. Not a sure thing. Note that you have to jump into these doors to actually do the mini game. Sometimes you'll get knocked in by enemies. Sometimes to the detriment of your efforts. That final Briggs note was chase me. We didn't really elaborate on that at the time, but in the final stage in particular, but you can somewhat use it in this one as well. And before I finish that thought, let's see what minigame this is. It's a new one. Blaze.
Alright, the infamous Chopsticks minigame right here, taken from the film. Remember when it was exciting when Daniel was able to capture 1 fly with chopsticks in the movie? Here you gotta get 6 to get the full bonus. I like to keep the chopsticks at the highest position in the air and just time pressing A or B when one of those flies is dropping in range just above our head. Just be ready, hit that, Probably the easiest of all of the mini games to ace and get the maximum crane kick and drum punch bonus.
Yeah, I'd say the chopsticks are certainly the easiest of the three, because it's not dependent on health, and it's not really difficult like this one is here. There we go. All right, got a second one. But you should be good on crane punches, or crane kicks and drum punches at this point. But yeah, the idea with the Chase Me is getting, since there can only be two of these chosen guys on the screen at a time, just getting them both behind you and just basically keeping them on the screen, not scrolling them off like we have an opportunity to kind of do here if we're careful. Just jump over them, and then, yeah, but then, yeah, you got, well, okay, that's, don't want to get surrounded there. Anyway, we're almost at the end of the stage, as you can see from the map right there, so let's get some tips. Thank you, Mr. Miyagi. From the Miyagi of Boss Tips, Gary.
Boss beaters. Alright, this one's a little odd. You don't actually have to fight the boss. Just stand kind of in the middle of that pole and start jumping. The wind will push you a little bit to the left, but this should position you just right to climb up there. Just be careful about getting knocked off by any projectiles or the enemies at the bottom, but not too difficult.
Thank you, Gary. Alright, so this is where we can really make use of our Chase Me of the Briggs notes right here. Just keep these two guys on the screen. Be careful about jumping into these open doors. You don't want to trigger a mini game, which will reset everything once you come back out. The boulders rolling around on the ground aren't too bad. But, yeah, just keep this up and see how far you can get. If you're lucky, you can make it all the way to the end of the stage. Otherwise, this is a very difficult level. But if you cheese it like this, and that's the problem. Alright, so we gotta reset now. There's a couple spots where you can kind of lure them and get them to stack on top of each other below you and then jump over them. Getting back to that one Briggs note we didn't mention, stay low. You'll find that whoever's higher in this game with higher ground, despite the adage of, high ground gives you that advantage, yeah, that person always invariably takes more damage. So you want to stay low, get those kicks when the enemies are above you. You never want to be above those enemies. We're looking pretty good though, got the enemies in a nice power walk and conga line, so let's go to Gary a bit early for tips on the final boss in the Karate Kid.
Boss beater. Right, the final boss fight here in the Karate Kid. So the key is to stay on the left-hand side after the screen scrolls and the boss shows up. This ensures that the girl doesn't get scared into going into the water on her own. So run over here to the left-hand side, do a couple crane kicks just like every other opponent in this game. Takes about 3 to take him down, and you have beaten the Karate Kid.
Good strategy, thank you very much, Gary. Don't want her to fall in the water, that's a quick end right there for you, but you have successfully got it. Daniel-san through this... What? Fluff!
Oops, sorry, Professor. I think there must have been some dust on the cartridge. Yeah, I'll wipe it off.
Dust, huh? Alright, thanks, Fluff. Yeah, good stuff today from all my TAs, but there you go. Crappy ending, not a great game, not the worst game, honestly. I don't hate it as much as some other games, probably because it's so short. I will give it that. If you're going to be bad, at least be short. That's what I say. That's the Video Games 101 motto. But anyway, if you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing to enroll in these classes. We do one of these classes every single week in the same spot. We'd love to have you enrolled. Click that like button as well if you don't mind. Really does help us out to make future classes for you. And lastly, leave a comment. Do you hate this game? Or do you just kind of, like me, shrug your shoulders and say, it's not hurting anything. It's fine. That's our time this week, though. I love that blank expression on their faces. I imagine they're looking off at another game, a better game. Maybe a Kung Fu from Nintendo, thinking, why can't that be us? But that's our time this week, class. We'll see you next week in the same spot for next week's class right here on Video Games 101. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and comment on this video, and click subscribe if you haven't already, as this seriously helps me to keep making great content for you. And check the description of this video to see what song is playing right now.